I don't sleep much anymore. At 93, your body decides it's had enough of long nights, I suppose. So I sit, I think, I remember. And the thing I remember most, the thing that comes back clearest, sharper than my wife's face on our wedding day, sharper than my children being born, is a morning in the Pacific. January 1944. A beach with no name anyone would recognize, and a Marine named Tommy Briggs doing something none of us thought was possible. He looked at that gun, he looked at what was coming toward us, and then he did what only Tommy Briggs could do. I'm 93 years old, and I'm telling you this now because the world needs to know his name. My name is Walter Pruitt. I grew up in Macon, Georgia. I enlisted in the United States Marine Corps in the spring of 1943, 3 weeks after my 19th birthday. I wasn't a hero. I want to be clear about that from the start. I was a kid who was scared most of the time and just kept moving because stopping felt worse. But this story isn't about me. It's about a man named Corporal Thomas Eugene Briggs. Tommy to everyone who knew him, from a small town called Salina, Tennessee. He was 22 when I met him, tall, quiet, the kind of quiet that isn't empty, you understand, the kind that's full of something, full of thinking. Most men talk too much in the Corps, nerves mostly. Tommy never did. He watched, he tinkered. He took things apart to see how they worked and put them back together better than before. None of us knew, not really, what that habit would mean one January morning in 1944. But I'm getting there. I want to make sure you understand who Tommy was before I tell you what he did. Because what he did only makes sense when you know who he was. Tommy grew up fixing things. That's how he described himself the first night I really talked to him. We were on a transport ship somewhere in the Pacific, probably 4 days out from where they were sending us, and most of the men were either playing cards or trying to sleep. Tommy was sitting on his bunk, taking apart a field radio that technically belonged to the communications unit. I said, "You're going to get in trouble for that." He didn't even look up. Already fixed the problem. Just want to know why it happened. That was Tommy. His father ran a small machine shop in Salina. Tommy had been working in it since he was 8 years old. By the time he was 12, he was repairing farm equipment for neighbors. By 16, he'd rebuilt a truck engine from scratch, using parts from 3 different vehicles that didn't run. He told me once that machines made sense to him in a way that most other things didn't. A machine does exactly what you tell it to do, he said. You understand its limits and you understand what it needs, it won't let you down. He paused then and looked out at the water. People, he said, are more complicated. He wasn't wrong about that. When the war came, Tommy enlisted the same week as most of the boys from his county. Not out of fury, not out of patriotism exactly, or at least not the loud chest-beating kind. He went because his older brother Raymond went, and because Raymond had a bad knee that made him slow, and Tommy wasn't going to let Raymond be slow alone. Raymond made it home. Tommy did too, but only because of what happened on that beach. January 14th, 1944. I don't need to look that date up. It is carved into me the same way weather carves stone. Slow, deep, permanent. We were holding a position on a small island. I won't say which one. The family asked me to keep certain details private. And we had been under pressure for 2 days straight. Not constant fire, worse than that. The stop and start kind, where you'd get an hour of silence and start to breathe again, and then it would come back louder than before. The night of the 13th, our intelligence, and I use that word generously, Told us the Japanese push would come from the eastern tree line at dawn. It didn't. It came from the north, from a clearing we'd been using as a supply route. And it came fast. You know how water comes over a dam when the structure finally gives? That's the only way I can describe it. Organized, purposeful, and completely overwhelming in the first few seconds. We had 3 machine gun positions set up. 2 were facing east. The one facing north was Tommy's. He was running a 20mm AN/M2 aircraft cannon, not a standard infantry weapon, not something any of us had been trained on particularly well. It had been salvaged off a wrecked Corsair 2 weeks earlier, brought in because we were short on heavier weapons and someone in the chain of command decided it was better than nothing. Most of us looked at that gun and saw a problem. Too slow to traverse. The feed mechanism jammed every 40 rounds in the Pacific humidity. The sighting was calibrated for aerial targets, not ground-level threats at close range. We saw a problem. Tommy saw a project. For 3 weeks, in whatever time he could find, after watch, before dawn, during supply rotations, he had been working on that gun, adjusting the feed mechanism, altering the traverse mount with parts cannibalized from a destroyed vehicle, recalibrating the sight line by hand, degree by degree. Nobody told him to. Nobody asked him to. He just looked at it and decided it should work better. That morning when the northern clearing erupted and my blood turned to ice water in my chest, Tommy Briggs was already at his position. Like he knew. Or maybe like he was always ready. I could never decide which. What happened in the next 3 minutes I have replayed in my mind thousands of times. Thousands. When the first wave came through that clearing, there were at least 60 men, moving in tight formation, moving fast. Our rifles were up. Our boys were firing. And then Tommy's gun opened up. I need you to understand, that gun, in its original configuration, was already a powerful weapon. But what Tommy had done to it, I still don't fully understand all of it. He'd modified the feed system so it could sustain fire without the humidity-caused jams. He'd widened the traverse arc so he could sweep a fuller field. He'd adjusted the firing rate. What came out of that position was not what any of us expected. It was controlled, precise, rhythmic in a way that felt almost mechanical in its perfection. Later, when our lieutenant did the accounting, and he did it because he couldn't believe what he'd witnessed, he calculated that Tommy's modified gun was putting down roughly 20 enemy soldiers per minute. Per minute. That's not a boast. I'm not saying it to glorify the violence of it. I'm saying it because what it meant in practical terms was that the northern breach, the one that should have overwhelmed our position and potentially ended all of us, was stopped, held, broken apart at its spine. I was 30 yards to Tommy's left. I could see him clearly. He wasn't frantic. He wasn't yelling. He was working. Moving the traverse with deliberate, measured sweeps, adjusting, reading what was in front of him the same way he'd read that broken field radio on the transport ship. Calm. Completely, impossibly calm. At one point, and this is the detail I always stop on, the feed mechanism stuttered, just for a second, maybe 2 seconds. Tommy didn't panic. He reached down, made one adjustment with his right hand without looking, and the gun resumed. 2 seconds. 2 seconds that could have been the end. When the 3rd minute passed and the northern clearing was quiet, I heard a corpsman next to me exhale like he hadn't breathed since the attack began. "What?" he said, was that. I didn't answer him. I was watching Tommy Briggs carefully lower himself back from the gun position and sit down on the ground. He put his face in his hands, not crying, at least not that I could see, just putting his face in his hands, the way a man does when something very large has passed through him and he needs a moment before he can be in the world again. I understood that completely. We held that position for another 11 days. Tommy went back to his gun the next morning like nothing had happened. Fixed 2 things he wasn't satisfied with. Made a note in a small notebook he kept in his breast pocket. He never talked about what he'd done, not once. When the lieutenant put him in for a commendation, Tommy seemed more embarrassed than anything else. Said the gun deserved the credit more than he did. Said he just fixed what was broken. We rotated out in early February. By March, we were being sent somewhere new with a new set of problems and a new set of things that needed fixing. Tommy and I stayed close through the rest of the war. He made it home to Salina, went back to his father's machine shop, eventually opened his own. We wrote letters for 30 years. His were always short, practical. Updates on the shop, his kids, the weather. He died in 1991, heart failure. I went to the funeral. Stood in that Tennessee churchyard in January, which felt right somehow. January always belonged to Tommy in my mind. His son came up to me afterward and said his father had mentioned me, said I was a good man to have beside you when things went wrong. I thought about telling him the truth, that it was the other way around, entirely the other way around. I'm 93 years old. I don't have a grand speech to give you. I'm too old and too tired for grand speeches. But I'll tell you what I know. I know that the men who saved us more often than not weren't the loudest ones. They weren't the ones making speeches or drawing attention to themselves. They were the ones who spent 3 weeks fixing a gun nobody asked them to fix. The ones who studied a problem when everyone else had accepted it. The ones who, when the moment came, were simply ready. Tommy Briggs never called himself a hero. He would have objected to me calling him one now. But here's what I believe, after 93 years of thinking about it. A hero isn't someone without fear. A hero is someone who fixes the gun anyway. Whatever your gun is, whatever broken thing sits in front of you that everyone else has walked past, I'm asking you to be the person who stops, who looks at it, who decides it should work better. Tommy's gone. Most of my brothers are gone. But the lesson they left me is still alive. And now, I suppose, it's yours.